Two weeks in a row. But I promise you won't get me for a little while after that, okay? So, we're going to start a new series, as we've already heard, and it's all about connecting with others, which is a phrase that we've used quite a lot already, but we need to start thinking about how we're doing that. How are we doing with that, and what more could we be doing? And to help us along the way, we're going to look at Luke. But before that, thought for a bit of fun, recently there's been a photography award series. And it struck me that when I looked at these award-winning photographs, things weren't always as they seem. Do you ever see that sometimes? You look at something and it just isn't quite what it seems. So, a friendly raccoon. So we could think, well, maybe he's asking for permission to leave the room. Maybe he's just waving to the passers-by. He's in Florida. Maybe he's just seeing some tourists that have passed by. Maybe if you look at the white snow on his paws, maybe he's just thrown a crafty snowball and he's just owning up to it. Things aren't always what they seem. Apparently, he was a very happy raccoon because he'd just been feeding on some shrimp. Okay, here's the next one. Can you make that out? Can you make that out? You heard the joke about, how did the duck cross the road? Well, the little duckling there, you look at first and you think, how on earth did that duckling convince all those turtles to line up so they could cross the lake? Because in certain parts of the world, of course, lakes are dangerous territories to cross if you're a little duckling. So how on earth did the duck do that? But if you look a little bit closer, you'll probably see that there's a log that's fallen into the pond. And actually, all the turtles are basking on top of the log, and the duckling's just making the most of it. Things aren't always what they seem. You ready for this one? Okay. If you're not into shocking pictures, then look away now. Excuse you. Honestly, I looked at this one and I thought, if I'm really honest, and forgive me, I know this is being recorded, but does it look like that zebra's breaking wind? Apparently, I'm reliably told that was actually the caption that went with this, but I'm reliably told that it was picking up such a pace in the Kenya, where it was racing along at the time, that this was the dust coming off its feet at the time. And this is my favourite one. This is one of the winners. Look at that. Now, that might look like a winged horse to you at first glance, but take a closer look, and it's actually an antelope called a blue ball, and there's a crane behind it, hiding behind it. And actually, the large bird was scaring the antelope off in India's national park, or one of the national parks, because he got a little bit too close to the nest. Things aren't always what they seem. We're going to come back to that as we start to pick up our theme today. But I wanted to ask you a question first of all. How many of you, hands up, have had your invitation from His Royal Highness to go to the all-important events in 2 or 3 weeks' time? So if you, this is fake news, by the way, because I'm still waiting for mine. I'm sure it's going to come. I just thought I'd mock mine up for now. Rachel doesn't know I put +1 on it, but I just thought I'd do that for fun. But I'm pretty sure that it's on its way. I'm pretty sure it's in the post. After all, about 30 years ago, I'm sure Prince Charles will remember that I'd just come back from Latvia, and somebody who knew somebody made me write a report for Prince Charles about my trip to Latvia. I'm sure that's going to nail it. I'm sure that's going to get me my invitation. Or if not, probably about 12 or 13 years ago, Prince Charles and I opened a classroom in a school on St. David's Day. You don't believe me, do you? Can you look at some of the looks on the... No, she's... Right, here you go. Fake news. Look at that. Look at that handsome man on the left there, So it really did happen. I'm sure Prince Charles will have remembered this, and I'm sure that my invitation is on its way. I just haven't quite seen it yet. But, of course, we're all awaiting the exciting events of the coronation. But, when we come to think of someone like King Charles as he is now, he's a global figure, isn't he? A global figure known around the world. And because of this, if you Google King Charles, as I did yesterday, There are 946 million web pages that you can go to. That's quite a lot, isn't it? To look at content about King Charles. King Charles is the same age as my dad. So I Googled my dad. There were 78.8 million web pages to Michael Allen Andrews. But I'm absolutely confident that none of them actually relate to the Michael Allen Andrews who's my dad, given that he gets a very low digital presence. But with that much content out there, it's unavoidable, isn't it, as you're a global figure, that sometimes stories, myths, or what do we call it, fake news, start to undermine the truth. Just as we saw with those pictures earlier, what are we really seeing in those pictures? What story is really being told? And in a sense, that's why we're going to have a look at journeying with Luke. Luke, as we probably know, is an author of the Gospel of Luke, as we call it, in the New Testament. And for those who aren't aware, he's also the author of the book of Acts in the New Testament. So we're going to have a look at Luke, and we're going to have a look at those two books over the spring and summer. Luke was so aware that Jesus Christ was a person, a little bit like how we've just been talking about Prince Charles, that he was a person of global significance. And Luke was determined to ensure that an accurate account of the life and legacy of Jesus was captured for those who needed to hear it. So aware that there were already myths and fake news being generated immediately after the death of Christ and in the evolution of the early church. He decided to make it his job to examine the evidence and provide an accurate account. Luke was a physician, a doctor, so it's perhaps not surprising that he had a very particular style of writing, which he describes himself as investigations. He wants to undertake investigations, he says, drawing from eyewitnesses. Now, I like Luke because he's methodical. He's systematic. A lot of Luke is highly descriptive, and he goes into a lot of detail. If you look at the book of Luke, it's much larger than the book, say, of Mark, although Luke did draw from Mark to help inform his thinking and his understanding. It's also worth noting that Luke's writings account for more than a quarter of the New Testament. I didn't know that. Luke's writings account for almost just over a quarter of the New Testament. If you really need to know, it's 27%. So as we begin this new series together, let's start at the very beginning, okay? Here's Luke, and this is the beginning of Luke 1. What does he say? Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Now, it strikes me that this opening 4 verses from the Gospel of Luke are probably the 4 verses that we read the least, because we often just kind of skip the intro stuff because we want to get straight into the meat, don't we? But actually, sometimes it's important to look at the very beginning, to look at the purpose, the thinking behind what's being written. And as we're going to be looking and journeying with Luke over spring and summer, I just want to spend a few moments today, as it were, setting the scene. Luke was writing for someone who already knew him. We've got it here, Theophilus. So he didn't bother to introduce himself. Books in those days were handwritten. They were not mass-produced. And although Theophilus, I practice this so much, Theophilus probably had a few copies of these made for friends, all of them would have either known Luke or Theophilus at the end of the day. So no author's biography was necessary. In fact, Luke doesn't mention his name at all in the entire Gospel of Luke, nor in Acts. So were they really by Luke? We know it is the Gospel of Luke, and we know Luke's Acts of the Apostles because it's always been circulated as pieces of work produced by someone called Luke. The story that Luke is telling, however, is not about himself, though he was there to see many parts of it. So uncovering Luke is really a matter, it's an investigation in itself in one sense, pulling together scraps of evidence. He was born in Antioch, which is in modern-day Turkey. He died in Greece in AD 84. He was known as one of the apostles. In fact, in early historic literature, Epiphanes stated that Luke was one of the first 70 apostles. He was also known as Luke the Evangelist. Paul is an important character in the book of Acts, in Luke's book of Acts, considered as one of the apostles. And so perhaps it's not surprising that Paul mentions Luke at least twice. Luke not only draws evidence from what others have witnessed about Jesus, including what Mark wrote about in his gospel, but he also looked at early historic evidence and drew from his own experiences. One of my favourite observations, because I'm a bit geeky like this, when I look at the book of Acts, is something that happened in Acts 16. Listen to how Luke's account is written here at the beginning of the chapter. I'm going to start at verse 4. And Luke is talking about Paul on a missional journey, visiting various different places, spreading, as it were, the good news about Jesus, connecting others to God. And so this is how Luke describes it. As they traveled from town to town, they delivered the decisions reached by the apostles and elders in Jerusalem for the people to obey. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and grew daily in numbers. Paul and his companions traveled throughout the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been kept by the Holy Spirit from preaching the word in the province of Asia. When they came to the border of Mysia, they tried to enter Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus would not allow them to. So they passed by Mysia and went down to Troas. During the night, Paul had a vision of a man of Macedonia standing and begging him, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." After Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. From Troas, we put out to sea and sailed straight for Samothrace, and the next day we went to Neapolis. From there, we traveled to Philippi, a Roman colony, and the leading city of that district of Macedonia, and we stayed there several days. Now, you'll know by the number of names in there why I didn't ask anybody else to read that, because they wouldn't want to talk to me afterwards. But did you notice the difference there? I can't go backwards on here, but in the previous half of this, he's talking about they going out on those journeys, Paul and his companions. And suddenly we see that at Troas, Paul is joined by Luke. And now he's talking about we. Either that or Luke is making a very uncharacteristically clumsy mess of his grammar. So they were journeying together. Luke was in Troas, which is in Turkey. Later, we read also that Luke met with Paul again, where they traveled from Philippi, which is where Luke was living at the time. So these catch-ups were being used by Luke to gather further evidence, information, what's happening, so that he can chronicle it all to make sure that there's a thorough investigation of what's happening that can be recorded and shared with Theophilus and others for the future. It's not surprising that as Paul is mentioned so much in Luke's writings, Paul mentions Luke at least a couple of times in some of his own letters that were preserved in the New Testament. Paul does talk about Luke, for example, in Philemon. Paul adds a greeting at the end of the letter, and this is quite typical of Paul in Paul's letters, where as he signs off, he sends greetings from other people. And it's almost as if Paul is saying, oh, and lots of love from Luke as well, because he's mentioning Luke among others at the bottom. He calls Luke his fellow worker. And though that's not exactly recognized as a job description of its time, it does suggest that for Paul, Luke was someone that could be trusted. And it strikes me, if we're going to be looking at evidence over spring and summer of lessons that we can learn from Luke's chronicling, we need to know that Luke is a trusted writer. The second mention from Paul's letter to the Colossians, Paul adds Luke's greeting at the end of the letter, and he calls Luke the beloved physician. There's also plenty of historic, non-biblical evidence about Luke as the author of the Gospel of Luke and Acts. The Muratorian canon mentions Luke as the author in the 2nd century. Around a similar time, Irenaeus of Lyon, the Bishop of Lyon, also made reference to Luke as the author too. So his authorship's not really in dispute. Luke writes as an educated man, fluent in Greek. When he quotes Jewish scriptures, which he does a lot, he's clearly using the Greek translation. He's well read. He knows the conventions of how to write proper history in a way that would have been acceptable for his well-connected and well-educated friends like Theophilus. So as we read at the beginning of his gospel, he tells us that he's investigated everything and that he's wanted to produce an orderly account. He's using those eyewitness statements about the events to which he's relating. Theophilus and Luke are both already believers, but still they need to know the evidence. Being a Christian, remember, at that period in time was not exactly a popular pastime. It didn't do anything for their social standing to be a Christian. And at the very least, they were going to lose some friends from among the educated ruling Roman elite. So they needed to go through this with their eyes open if they were going to get this right. So from the style of writing that Luke adopted, it seems that he does really care for, as it were, a number of different things. It's worth observing. First of all, we know that that Luke is someone that really cares for the poor, someone who really cares for the marginalized. It's reflected a lot in the way that Luke tells us stories. For example, one of the things that Luke does, I'm just going to move on because you can see where Luke's journeying is and where he meets with Paul on Paul's various missional journeys just there over in Greece and in Turkey. Luke talks very much about the rough shepherds, as they're described at the beginning of the Christmas story. All the Gospels, we know, agree that women were unusually active and accepted in early Christianity, which was quite countercultural at the time. But it's Luke who preserves some of the best stories about women in Jesus' life. For example, Jesus' mother Mary and Elizabeth, when they meet together, that's all captured in detail in Luke 1. Elizabeth being the mother of John the Baptist. Luke, more than any of the other gospel writers, notices that Jesus' mission was always potentially inclusive. In Acts, he chronicles how the Christian community grew so that it was no longer, unlike the religious community of its time, racially, culturally, or socially exclusive. In other words, he was a very inclusive person, and he recognized that the good news of Jesus was for everybody, not just middle-class church. This is a movement that starts, in one sense, with the small people. One contemporary commentator, reflecting on Luke's writing, said this: "All in all, I think Luke would have been a nice man to have dinner with. He would listen without letting his eyes wander to find someone more important. He'd talk wisely and well, but he'd make you feel that however unimportant and mundane your life might appear, it could actually be part of some huge, exciting movement for change." I'll say that again. However unimportant and mundane your life might appear, it could actually be part of some huge, exciting movement for change. Does life feel like that for us? Throughout the whole of the Gospel of Luke and that follow-up book of Acts, as it were, the chronicling of the early church, we see Luke being described in great detail. Luke describing in great detail three rather familiar connections. I think we see Jesus and his followers connecting with God. We see Jesus and his followers connecting with one another. And we see Jesus and his followers connecting others with God. Does this ring a bell? Have we shared this once or twice already? Of course, for some time now at Pershore Community Church, we've been drawing attention to that mandate to be a church that's all about connecting. After all, how can we be a community if we're not making connections? And yet, I suspect if we're honest, and maybe this is just me, we probably focus more on connecting with God and connecting with one another than we do connecting others with God, if we're really honest. So this spring, this summer series is all about connecting others with God. We're going to journey with Luke, and we're going to explore how Luke can help us to better understand what it means to connect others with God. Now, as most of you will probably already be aware, we're about to start a recruitment process for a new missional leader, a new member of the team, and a paid, as it were, member of the team, with a mandate particularly to focus on reaching out within our communities, particularly perhaps to those in their 20s and 30s across our communities. But it's really important for us to recognize that we're not looking to outsource our responsibility onto somebody else. We're not looking to outsource our individual and collective sense of calling and responsibility for connecting others with God. We may not all see ourselves as evangelists. I'm pretty sure I don't. But we're all called to be connecting. We're all called to play our part and, to use Paul's phrase, to be fellow workers. So even as we look to embrace a new member of staff to help connect others to God and to help us to connect others to God, this is perhaps a timely series for us to start thinking about, well, what does it mean for us? What does it mean for me to be someone that's called to go out connecting others to God? What does that mean? Have a pause for a minute. What does it mean for me to be connecting others to God? How can God be perhaps drawing something out of me this spring or summer? Is there somebody that God's wanting me to go that extra step with, to take that extra bit of time with? Or maybe it's just a divine moment that we don't know yet, that God's just going to place before us this spring or summer, a conversation that we weren't anticipating, where we have a choice. Just to share a little bit about our faith, our own story. We're not all called to be evangelists, but we've all got a story. We've all got something that we can share, haven't we? What is it God's calling out of us this spring, this summertime? We're all about connecting. We're all part of God's fellow workmanship. So, we're going to look through Luke's investigations and chronicles over the spring and summer months. We're going to journey with Luke over 10 sessions. We're even going to bring in some guest speakers, and we'll be working steadily through some of the stories of Luke's investigations, some of his writings from both the Gospel and from Acts, to explore with examples how we can learn better to understand what it means to connect others with God, what the implications of that might be for each one of us, so that we can put into practice that vision that we shared in January and February to be, can we remember it? Vibrant followers of Jesus, committed to making a difference in our communities. I was going to ask you all to repeat it, but I won't do that now. We may not all receive our invites to a king's coronation, but we are known by a King of Kings, and he invites us all to play our part in connecting others with him. Amen?